The night the screams returned to the Hensley woods, the fog rolled in so thick it clung to the treetops like an exhaled warning. Most people in Dry Creek had forgotten the Hensley sisters by then, choosing to erase the memory of the family whose windows were always boarded, whose lanterns never flickered past sunset, and whose children were never seen in town after the summer of 1987. But the woods remember what people try to bury, and on that night, they gave the first sign that something long hidden was clawing its way back. The abandoned barn stood crooked on its foundation, ribs of weathered wood showing through the splintered siding. Locals said it had been empty for decades, yet a faint knocking came from inside, steady and desperate, like someone trying to send a message from a place where light could not reach. A hunter named Wells Turner heard it first as he passed along the ridge, his flashlight trembling in his grip as the sound matched his heartbeat, slow at first, then frantic, as if it recognized him. Everyone who grew up near Dry Creek knew the whispers about the Hensleys. 3 sisters, strange as the forest itself, wandering barefoot through the grass with tangled hair and eyes that watched people too closely. Their father kept them away from civilization, claiming blood must remain pure for the family to survive. Then there was the brother, Elijah, the only boy, silent and pale, who vanished one stormy night after a terrifying cry echoed across the valley. No one looked for him. No one dared. But now, standing beside the decaying barn, Wells felt something breathing behind the wooden slats, something that shuffled and scraped as if testing the walls that bound it. And beneath that breath came a second sound, soft, trembling, unmistakably human. A whisper rising from the darkness, calling a name that had not been spoken in years. The air turned ice cold. The forest fell silent. And the knocking finally stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside knew it had been found. The discovery of the barn begins on a cold, brittle morning when the woods feel emptier than usual, the kind of silence that presses against the skin like an omen. The hunter, Wells Turner, is not easily rattled. He has spent most of his life navigating the deep thickets of the Hensley woods, where shadows move strangely and the wind sometimes carries sounds that don't belong. But this morning feels different from the moment he steps off the main trail. The fog lies low, brushing against his boots, and every branch seems to lean inward, pointing him toward a part of the forest he usually avoids out of instinct alone. As he moves deeper, the trees grow denser, almost forming a tunnel that leads directly toward the abandoned barn the town rarely speaks of. Wells has seen the place before from a distance, always careful to keep moving, unwilling to linger around anything tied to the Hensley family. He doesn't intend to go near it today either, but a faint sound catches his attention, a rhythmic tapping, too deliberate to be wind, too steady to be an animal. It's faint at first, almost like water dripping onto hollow wood, but it echoes in a strange, patterned way that instantly raises the hairs on the back of his neck. Wells freezes, listening as the tapping continues, 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 2 more. He knows these woods well enough to recognize natural sounds, and this one makes his pulse kick up. Curiosity battles with dread as he follows the source, the sound growing clearer with every step. When the barn finally comes into view, slouched beneath broken beams with vines curling across its sides, the tapping becomes unmistakably real, coming from inside, steady and purposeful. The barn is a skeleton of what it once was, its roof partially collapsed, its doors warped and hanging crooked. No one should be inside. No one would choose to be inside. Yet the tapping persists, louder now, almost synchronized with Wells' heartbeat. He takes a cautious step closer, feeling the coldness of the air thicken as though the barn itself exhales frost. The tapping shifts suddenly, becoming frantic for a moment before settling back into a slow, deliberate pattern, like someone trapped in a dark place sending out a message in the only way they can. Wells wants to turn back, tell himself it's nothing, but the sound is too human to ignore. Each hesitant knock feels like a plea reaching out from behind the rotten boards, a call meant for anyone brave or foolish enough to hear it. And in that moment, Wells realizes he isn't just hearing something unusual, he is witnessing the first crack in a secret the woods have tried to swallow for decades. The Hensley family's fading legacy lingers through Dry Creek like a stain that never fully washed away, something people try not to bring up but can't completely forget. Long before the barn turned into a collapsing husk in the woods, the Hensley sisters were already a quiet legend of their own, 3 girls who grew up far from the rest of town, always seen together, always moving with a strange, synchronized stillness that made people uneasy. Ada, the eldest, walked with a sternness beyond her years, her expression carved from something colder than childhood should allow. Miriam hovered close behind her, nervous and twitchy, glancing at anyone who looked their way as though expecting a threat. And Jo, the youngest, rarely lifted her eyes at all, trailing the others like a shadow afraid of being left behind. Most families in Dry Creek attended gatherings, fairs, school events, even church picnics, but the Hensleys never did. People said their father raised them with strict rules about outsiders, insisting the world beyond their woods was full of sickness and lies. The sisters seemed to believe him. They were grown before most folks heard their voices for the first time, and even then, they spoke softly, as though speech itself was something dangerous they weren't allowed to use freely. As the years passed and their father grew older, the sisters retreated even deeper into isolation. They were spotted at the market only when they absolutely needed supplies, always buying in bulk, always leaving quickly, always avoiding conversation. The locals whispered among themselves, wondering how three young women could look so pale and underfed yet still move with such strange, rigid purpose. After their father died, the sisters' presence in town dwindled until it nearly disappeared. Their house, hidden behind a curtain of pines, became a place of speculation. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and knock, but most couldn't bring themselves to do it. Adults kept their distance out of uneasy respect or quiet fear. Every so often someone claimed they saw a lantern flicker through the trees late at night or heard chanting drifting through the woods, but no one ever investigated enough to prove it. Rumors grew like mold on forgotten walls, whispers of unusual noises on their property, strange visitors who came at night, and glimpses of the sisters wandering through the woods barefoot even in winter. Eventually, people stopped talking about them altogether, pretending the family simply faded into the forest like mist. But the truth was that their silence only made the mystery heavier, and the weight of that mystery lay untouched for years until the barn's tapping returned, dragging the name Hensley back into the light with an unease that no one in Dry Creek was prepared to face. The disturbing history of the Hensley family begins long before the whispers of chained children and strange rituals spread through Dry Creek. It starts with Caleb Hensley, a man who arrived in the region already carrying an air of unease about him, a man who spoke rarely and observed everything with a cold, assessing stare that made neighbors instinctively keep their distance. Caleb inherited a small stretch of land deep in the woods and built a home far from the main road, as though he wanted the trees themselves to swallow him and whatever secrets he brought. When he eventually started a family, people noticed right away that he raised his children differently, almost like they were being prepared for something the world outside shouldn't witness. The Hensley children never attended school, never played with other kids, never joined town gatherings. When someone politely asked Caleb why the children were kept so isolated, he answered in vague phrases about preserving what's pure and blocking out the world's corruption. Most chalked it up to religious extremism or personal paranoia, but there was something deeper in his tone, something that made people choose not to press him further. What unsettled neighbors the most wasn't the isolation itself but the rules they witnessed when Caleb brought the children into town. The siblings were forbidden to speak to anyone. They walked in strict lines, Ada leading, Miriam and Joe behind her, Elijah trailing like a ghost. Any attempt at eye contact would be met with Caleb's icy glare, and even the friendliest gesture, like offering the children sweets, was swiftly rejected. People living closest to the Hensley property occasionally heard strange chants drifting through the woods, low and rhythmic, never loud enough to decipher but unmistakably human. Some claimed the sounds came from the barn, even back when it was still in decent shape. Others insisted they heard Caleb yelling at the children late at night, scolding them for breaking the line or inviting rot into the blood. Over time, unsettling details leaked out. A doctor who once visited their cabin said the children were thin, pale, and jumpy, reacting to sudden movements like small animals trained to fear lashes. A postal carrier recalled seeing odd wooden carvings hanging from the trees on their property, symbols that resembled twisted versions of old folk marks meant to ward off evil. According to rumor, Caleb believed the family blood had to remain untouched by the outside world or it would bring ruin to them all. The most disturbing part of their history was Elijah's role. As the only boy, he seemed to carry the heaviest burden of Caleb's twisted beliefs. People remembered the boy's haunted eyes, how he flinched at the slightest noise and how Caleb kept him closest, watching him with a scrutiny that bordered on obsession. Whatever the Hensley father believed, he forced it upon his children with unyielding control, molding them into something cut off from the rest of humanity. And when Elijah eventually disappeared, that history, once whispered quietly, suddenly felt like a warning the town had ignored for far too long. Elijah's disappearance became the silent wound at the center of the Hensley family, a moment that people in Dry Creek still recalled with an uneasy shiver even though no one had seen the boy often enough to truly know him. He had always been the quietest of the siblings, slipping behind his sisters like a fading shadow, rarely lifting his head, never responding to a greeting even when others tried gently to coax a word from him. There was a fragility in him that made townsfolk feel both pity and fear, something in his eyes that looked trapped, like he was always listening for something the rest of the world couldn't hear. So when he vanished on that storm-split night, the event carried a strange weight despite the family's silence about it. The storm had arrived without warning, a violent pounding of rain that hammered the roofs of Dry Creek and sent thin rivers of mud flowing down the wooded slopes. People later recalled hearing a cry around midnight, a long, sharp sound carried by the wind, high enough to be human but distorted by the storm so heavily that no one could be sure. The Hensley cabin sat far enough in the woods that the noise could have belonged to a fox or a panicked deer, yet the next morning, when the weather cleared, locals spotted Ada and Miriam in town, soaking wet, their faces drawn tight and pale as they gathered supplies with frantic energy they could barely conceal. Joe wasn't with them. Neither was Elijah. And when someone casually asked where the youngest siblings were, Ada muttered something about chores and walked away quickly, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. It was only days later that people realized Elijah hadn't been seen since the storm. The townsfolk waited for the sisters to report him missing, but they never did. They didn't question neighbors. They didn't search the woods. They simply stopped bringing Elijah with them, as if a piece of their quiet procession had been removed and they expected everyone to accept it without explanation. Some said the boy had finally run away, escaping the suffocating rules and the strange rituals his father forced upon him. Others believed something darker had happened inside the Hensley home that night, something the sisters were now forced to hide. A few swore they'd heard movement around the barn in the days following the storm, soft thuds and muffled cries that stopped whenever someone approached. But no one investigated further. People in Dry Creek had learned long ago not to trespass on Hensley land, not to meddle in whatever strange traditions governed that family. Elijah simply vanished, swallowed by the woods or by his own bloodline, and life in the town continued uneasily, pretending the absence of a boy with frightened eyes was something that could be carried away by a single night of rain. Strange ritual markings began appearing in the woods years after Elijah vanished, long after the Hensley family had retreated so deeply into their isolation that most people assumed the sisters barely left their own land. The first discovery was made by a pair of hikers who wandered off a marked trail during early autumn. They returned to town pale and unsettled, describing wooden totems hanging from thin branches like crude ornaments. Each one was carved in a distorted shape, some resembled twisted humanoid figures, others looked like strange creatures crouched low, and a few were nothing more than tangled knots of wood bound together with strips of dried grass. The markings didn't look like anything from local folklore, and certainly not like decorations. They felt like warnings, nearly alive in the way they swayed without wind. As weeks passed, more hikers reported seeing symbols carved deep into tree trunks. They weren't random scratches, they were deliberate, swirling patterns that seemed to form spirals and sharp edges, shapes that made the eyes uncomfortable when traced too long. Some of the carvings appeared freshly made, with the wood beneath the bark still pale and raw. Others were older, their edges darkened and weathered yet still distinct. Hunters began avoiding the northern stretch of the Hensley woods, insisting the place felt wrong, as if stepping over an invisible boundary that hummed with something ancient and unsettled. Word spread quietly through Dry Creek that the markings resembled those once seen hanging around the Hensley property decades earlier, back when Caleb was alive and enforcing his strange beliefs. A few older residents remembered carved blocks stacked near the family's porch, etched with symbols Caleb claimed would keep the bloodline safe from taint. No one ever understood what he meant, but the symbols in the woods now looked eerily similar, as though the old traditions hadn't died with him at all. Instead, it seemed the sisters had carried them forward, deepening them into something even more unsettling. What disturbed people most was the path these markings seemed to trace. When placed on a map, the totems and carvings formed a crooked line leading directly toward the old, abandoned barn that had become the heart of local superstition. The closer one got to the barn, the more frequent, and more grotesque, the symbols became. Some carvings showed what looked like eyes, dozens of them, overlapping each other in spirals that seemed to watch from the bark. Others depicted a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs, always scratched beside a smaller, huddled shape that could only be interpreted as a child. Rumors spread that the symbols were not warnings to keep people out but signs left by the sisters to contain something inside, something that should never be allowed to step beyond the timbered line. With each new discovery, the woods felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were bearing witness to secrets carved into their skin. And those few who dared walk the path marked by the symbols claimed they could feel a faint vibration under their feet, like footsteps echoing far below the forest floor, guiding them toward a place no one in Dry Creek had any business approaching. The account of the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Reddick, was one of the few surviving threads tying the town's unease to the truth about the Hensley family, though most people dismissed her words as the ramblings of a woman too old to trust her own memories. Yet her voice always carried a tremor when she spoke of what she heard all those years ago, and even skeptics felt something tighten in their chest when she described the night that changed everything for her. She lived closest to the Hensley property back then, her small cabin sitting on the other side of a narrow creek that cut through the forest like a crooked scar. The woods were quiet in those days, thick with crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, but on one summer night she claimed the silence shattered with a sound she would never forget. It came late, long after sundown, when she had been sitting by her window crocheting by lantern glow. At first she thought the noise was an animal, maybe a raccoon trapped in a trough or a fox caught in wire, but the cry rose again, sharper and too desperate to belong to any creature she knew. It sounded young, frighteningly young, like a child calling out in a mix of terror and confusion. She hesitated only a moment before stepping onto her porch, drawn toward the sound despite the dread blooming in her stomach. The cries came from the direction of the Hensley barn, echoing faintly through the trees, each one muffled as though swallowed by thick wooden walls. Mrs. Reddick grabbed her lantern and crossed the creek, calling out to ask if someone needed help. She made it halfway to the barn before she saw movement among the trees. Ada and Miriam emerged first, their faces pale and eyes gleaming with a strange panic, followed by Jo, who clutched something close to her chest. The sisters moved toward her quickly, too quickly, their steps soft but urgent. Ada raised a long, rusted knife, the kind used for gutting animals, and held it up just enough to catch the lantern light. There was no rage in her face, no shouting, only a cold, steady warning. Miriam whispered something harsh under her breath, a sound that felt more like a growl than speech. Jo didn't speak at all, she just watched with wide, fearful eyes. The cries from the barn stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating stillness that made the air feel wrong. Mrs. Reddick froze, realizing she had stepped somewhere she was never meant to be. Ada told her, in a low, controlled voice, to go home, to forget what she heard, and to never step foot near the barn again. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding, and once she reached her porch she locked her doors for the first time in years. She wanted to report what she heard, but every time she picked up the phone, she imagined those pale faces and that gleaming knife. So she stayed silent, carrying the weight of that night alone, the memory resurfacing every time she heard a distant cry or the wind moving through the trees in a way that sounded almost like a child calling for help. The return of the voices began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the woods were trying to ease Dry Creek back into a nightmare it had once managed to bury. At first, it was just the tapping, soft, rhythmic, almost harmless enough to dismiss as an animal scraping at loose boards. But those who ventured close enough soon realized the sound carried a pattern, a deliberate pause and repetition that felt too structured to be nature. Hunters complained about hearing faint murmurs drifting between the trees at dusk, voices that slipped in and out of hearing like whispers drowned by wind. Most assumed it was their own imagination playing tricks on them, yet no one could explain why the murmurs always seemed to come from the direction of the abandoned barn. Wells Turner, the first to hear the tapping up close, returned weeks later with the excuse of checking his traps, though he avoided admitting to himself why his feet pulled him back toward that decaying structure. The forest felt colder near the barn, the usual chorus of insects and birds falling silent the moment he stepped past the first line of trees marked by the old totems. The tapping was louder that day, the knocks more forceful, almost expectant. But it wasn't until the tapping stopped that Wells experienced something far more chilling. A soft hum rose from within the barn, faint but layered, like more than one voice trying to speak through the same throat. The sound vibrated through the air, thin and breathy, a tone that made the hair along Wells' arms stand straight. Other locals began reporting similar encounters. Campers swore they heard someone whisper their name from the woods at night, each syllable stretched painfully thin. A teenager who wandered too close to the barn during a dare claimed she heard a boy's voice echoing from beneath the floorboards, pleading for help before turning into a low, guttural rumble that made her run until her lungs burned. Even during the day, people described a pressure in the air near the structure, a dense, suffocating heaviness that felt like exhaled breath lingering on the back of their neck. One of the strangest details shared among those who heard the voices was how they sounded layered, never singular. A child's voice overlapped with a whisper too deep to belong to any human. Sometimes it sounded like arguing, other times chanting, but never clearly enough to understand. What terrified listeners most was the sense that the voices were aware of being heard. The murmurs would shift the moment someone stepped closer, stopping entirely if a person spoke aloud, then resuming again in a mocking echo the second they backed away. As more people came forward, the growing consensus was unsettling. Whatever was inside the barn wasn't speaking to itself. It was calling out, waiting for someone to listen, as if after all these years the darkness behind those collapsed walls had decided the time for silence had ended and the voices, Elijah's included, were ready to be heard again. The unraveling of the sisters' secret began the moment someone finally stepped inside the barn after decades of fear keeping everyone out. The barn had always carried a strange presence, its crooked frame and sagging roof suggesting age, but the cold that seeped from its interior felt far older. Those who approached claimed the air inside never matched the weather outside. It remained frigid even in midsummer, as though sunlight had never touched the ground beneath it. When Wells and 2 others from Dry Creek eventually mustered enough courage to force the warped door open, the first thing that hit them was the smell, damp earth mixed with rust and something sour that clung to the back of the throat. Dust swirled in the beam of Wells' flashlight, but most unsettling was the unnatural stillness, as if the barn had been holding its breath. At first glance, the interior looked empty aside from piles of rotting hay, rusted tools, and collapsed beams. But there were signs the place had been used long after the Hensley family was assumed to have abandoned it. Footprints, small and bare, were pressed into the dirt, not old enough to have faded. Ropes lay coiled in corners, frayed from repeated tension. Strange wooden symbols hung from the rafters, their shapes too similar to the carvings found in the forest. But the true horror didn't reveal itself until Wells kicked aside a mound of hay covering a section of the floor and discovered what looked like a seam, a thin crack outlining a door that lay flat against the ground. When they pried it open, the stench surged up immediately, a suffocating mix of rot and cold metal that burned the eyes. The cellar beneath wasn't deep, but its walls were packed earth, and embedded into that earth were iron rings and broken chains bolted into place with thick, rust-eaten screws. The chains weren't just old, they were worn down in places, frayed by something that had pulled against them for years with desperate, violent force. The dirt around them was clawed, not in random scratches but in deep, frantic grooves that formed overlapping arcs. Some were small enough to be human, but others were too long, too curved, too sharp at the tips, as if fingernails had grown into something else entirely. The cellar floor held remnants the men didn't want to identify, torn cloth, pieces of wood bitten through, and markings carved directly into the ground that matched the symbols in the woods. The realization hit them when they discovered a curled indentation in the far corner, like a nest where someone had slept or been forced to sleep. And beside it, etched with trembling, uneven strokes into the packed dirt, was a single name, Elijah. The truth clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Elijah had never run away. The sisters hadn't lost him. They had kept him here, locked in the dark beneath the barn for years. And whatever had happened inside that pit, whatever Caleb had taught them to preserve, whatever they believed lived within Elijah's blood, had changed him into something the sisters could no longer control. Something they tried to contain using chains, symbols, rituals, and silence. Something that, judging by the broken restraints and the claw marks reaching toward the exit, had eventually escaped. The horrible revenge at the center of the Hensley story began long before Elijah was locked beneath the barn. It started the moment he dared to defy the family doctrine his father had forced into him since birth. Caleb Hensley's twisted beliefs were built on the idea that the purity of their bloodline had to be protected at all costs, a notion he had carved into the minds of his children like scripture. The girls absorbed his teachings ruthlessly, repeating his rituals, obeying his warnings, and growing into reflections of his rigid obsession. Elijah, however, carried a quiet rebellion inside him, a longing for something beyond the suffocating rules and the oppressive fear that defined life in the Hensley home. He would wander too far from the property, linger near the creek too long, or stare into the woods with a kind of yearning the sisters interpreted as treason. In their minds, he was the weak link, the one who could ruin everything Caleb had built. After Caleb's death, the sisters clung to his ideology with a desperation that bordered on delusional. They believed Elijah's defiance endangered them, that his desire to leave or question their rituals could invite a curse or bring corruption into their blood. Whether they truly believed this or used it to justify their growing cruelty didn't matter. Their loyalty to their father's madness made them view Elijah not as a brother but as a danger. The night of the storm, when Elijah attempted to run, the sisters caught him before he reached the creek. Some say he begged them to let him go, others say he screamed for help, but whatever words he spoke were lost beneath the thunder. All that remained certain was the sisters dragging him back into the woods, their whispers sharper than the wind. They locked him in the cellar beneath the barn as punishment for his disobedience, intending to purify him through isolation and ritual, the same way Caleb had once punished them when they were small. At first, they visited him daily, chanting the phrases their father had taught, leaving food at the edge of the pit without ever meeting his eyes. But something changed in Elijah as the days turned into months. His voice grew distant, echoing strangely, layered as though more than one person spoke inside him. The sisters interpreted this as corruption, a sign that he had been touched by the outside, and their fear escalated. They tightened his restraints, carved symbols into the walls, and performed rituals meant to extract whatever they believed had infected him. But the rituals didn't fix Elijah. They changed him, twisted him in ways the sisters did not understand. By the time they realized he was no longer the boy they had locked away, it was too late. Their attempts to control him, to cleanse him, had created something far more terrifying. In their eyes, this was their revenge, not punishment for disobedience, but a desperate, self-justified vengeance against the brother they believed had betrayed the bloodline. They never understood that the true revenge was waiting beneath the barn, growing stronger in the dark, waiting for the chains to finally break.